Hello, testing. Testing. Perfect. Okay. We, like I said, are going to get started here in just a minute. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. For anyone who I do not know, my name is the Reverend Emily Campbell, and I have the honor of being the 35th senior pastor of this church. But that's something to hold on to. Am I actually the 35th? That is a little bit of a question we're going to dive into tonight. So welcome. We're so glad you're here. Before I begin, let me just say it's very possible that I may be the least qualified person here to lead this history seminar, as so many of you have been here a long time and has that terrific institutional knowledge, not only of this church, but of this city of Plymouth. And so I hope tonight, this is not the Emily show, but this is the Let's Learn from Each Other show and share the knowledge that God has gifted us and gifted this church. One thing I want to say as I start, a minister shared with me a story about church directories. Now, I know we kind of all cringe when it comes to taking church directories. That picture's almost as bad as your license, your passport picture. But yet, they're a wonderful, wonderful reminder of our past. And as we go through it as a minister, I can tell you, it is a privilege, because to see these pictures is to see the stories of each person and what's going on in their life. There's so many that we have loved and lost that we will see again. There are so many whose lives have moved on in different directions, so many children that have grown up, and it is wonderful to be able to celebrate all of those things. And this minister who shared with me her love for church directories, she told me a story that happened in her church. She said that she had a woman in her church who had suffered a stroke. And although her language, which was lost at first, was coming back, the last part of her language to come back was names. And so she could recognize people, but it was very hard for her to come up with their name. And she didn't have a lot of immediate family, but she had a church family that loved her so much. And they would come and visit her often. And every time that they came to visit, when they would walk in the door, even though she could not come up with their name, she would hold up the directory and wave it to let them know she understood that they were part of her family, her church family. And I feel that tonight is a celebration of the history, not of this church or even this community, but of our family. Because although none of us probably know all the names of the people who have gone before us in faith, we can wave the directory and say those stories we're going to share tonight, they're members of our family, and we get to build upon their stories with our own. So I'm grateful for this opportunity tonight. And with that, and let me just say a huge shout out of help to Miles and Robert, who are back there. Robert is live streaming us tonight for anyone who may not be here, who they can watch it later. And Miles has been helping me. You'll see we have images and all kind of things for you tonight. I will tell you there, back, Miles, God love him, he found this box of old VCR tapes, and we said, what could possibly be on this? And Miles somehow found a machine that got it working. And so if you're interested, on the way out tonight, we have a Valentine's Day dance playing here from the church. And Otto, was that you? Or you haven't seen it yet? Okay, there's a mixture. I'm pretty sure it's you. Don't take it that way. It's blurry, but it's Otto's voice. There's no question. So something to check out later on your way out. I also want to just highlight at the back, there is a table full of sort of historic memorabilia, old pictures, old bulletins, old church directories. Please take time to take a look, and thank you to the members of the Member Connect Committee who have provided coffee and water and treats back there. So this is an informal gathering at any point. If you feel the need, you need coffee or something, please help yourself. Okay, with that, let's get going. Miles, can you put up the first image for us? Are we working? Perfect. Okay. A lot of you may remember or may have read that our church originally formed in 1833. This is what Plymouth looked like in 1833. I am told that at the time when our church formed, there were exactly 5 buildings facing Kellogg Park. And they were, and if somebody can tell me what this is, a wildcat bank. Anybody? That's what it was called, a wildcat bank, 3 taverns, a drugstore, and our church. That was Plymouth when it was first started. And as you can see, no paved roads, all horse and buggy. And in this setting, if you can move off of Main Street and in your mind, picture the intersection of Penniman and Sheldon, what you would find there would be some of the property that Ira Bronson owned. And in his home, and he had a considerable property at that place, he gathered 14 prospective members, and some of these members were from other already existing churches in Ypsilanti and Farmington, but they lived closer and they wanted to worship closer. And so they gathered with these 14 members and 2 members of the Detroit Presbytery to organize this church. And as you can see, when they did that, this is the first page, as you can see, in the minutes of the Second Presbyterian Church of Plymouth. Does anybody know where the First Presbyterian Church of Plymouth was? Northville. You know your history. At this time, Plymouth encompassed not only the whole of Northville, but the whole of Canton. It was 4 times as large as it is today at that time. And believe it or not, the Northville Church organized in 1929, so roughly 4 years before we did, which is why they have the distinction of being first. But what is somewhat frustrating is we actually had a building before they did, and yet we were still second, even though that they building came later. So if we want to turn and look at our next slide, which is the first church building. This is the white church, which was erected in 1835. The 1835 became officially our date of our anniversary year, even though we were organized as a society in 1833. In 1835, not only did members of our church take it upon themselves to build this structure, they also took it upon themselves to call a minister. And so with the help of a mission agency, they were able to call our very first minister, who was Alexander Mcjunkin, who was called in July 1835. Now, I do think it's interesting, in keeping with this church's history and how this church works, the members of this church decided to build the church on their own before they called the minister. They just said, we need a church. We don't necessarily need the minister. We are going to do this. And they did this. The whole church was constructed before the minister arrived. And the minister actually came from the American Home Missionary Society, which was a joint mission agency between the Presbyterians and the Congregationals. And together they were trying to populate the West with churches. Not that we're that far west, but we were further west than the East Coast. And they were trying to get churches together out here. And so they were working together for years and years, the Presbyterians and Congregationals. And that is how we got that first minister. Now, I will tell you, Alexander Mcjunkin, age 28, from Pennsylvania, paid $200, lasted 6 months. That's as long as he lasted. Now, there is some argument in history whether it was the 3 bars in town that sent him over the edge. Not that he was, I think, struck by how difficult ministry was in the beginning. And I think he thought because he was called that there would be a ready church of people to come. And I think it was much harder work than he had anticipated. And so he actually not only shared his views in leaving, he ended up leaving the ministry altogether. So, which is a common thing that happens to ministers even now within their first 5 years of ministry. He ended up teaching in Ohio at a school which he loved, and it went on to be to do new things. But that is how our church started, with this first building and with that first minister. Now, if we go on from here, and Miles, if you've got stuff for us to move on. Oh, yep, great. Here's a list of membership from the very beginning. When the time the White Church was founded, they were 35 members of the church. And interestingly, rather than doing a capital campaign to raise money to build the church, they had 35 members, so they split the bill of the church 35 ways and handed it out and just said, this is what is expected of you. So it was a very, very different way of doing it. Now, thankfully, there were some members that were financially a little bit more able to help than other members. And so some of those members were able to cover costs for other people and gave generously, which was great. So from there, as you can see this list, and I will say, as you see all these old records in cursive, one of the issues we are going to have as a church going forward is that certain generations cannot read cursive anymore. And so if we hope to preserve these records, Ashley's in the back laughing, going, so no judgment zone. So if we are hoping to preserve these records, we do have a responsibility, I think, to type them up and to share them in some kind of digital form so we have them going forward. And I will say that Sam Hudson in his book has done a good job of this, but some of these individual records we don't have. It would be wonderful, wonderful to have. So, friends, from there, let me just say before we move on to our next slide, I know this is very hard to read in terms of just being far away. What you can't see on here, you can see a little bit at the top in Bradner. There are a lot of names in our early church records, are names that you might recognize from the history of Plymouth. Some of our founding members were George Starkweather, Ebenezer Penniman, Allen is there, yes, Lewis Huff, Thomas McClumpha, Michael Connor, who I guess owned a wonderful hardware store in downtown Plymouth, and he had served as the president of the village of Plymouth 10 separate times. C.J. Hamilton was an early member, as in Hamilton Street. He also invented the Daisy air rifle and became the head of that company. And there were others who came as well in terms of where they were and what they have done. Ebenezer Penniman was a U.S. Congress representative, and Jonathan Shearer served 3 terms in the Michigan Senate and helped to establish Eastern Michigan University. So we have been blessed and are very, very tied to the history of Plymouth by the people that have served our church in the past. And one of the things that those early members did was that they decided that this original white church was too small. And so, again, they acted on their own and decided that it was time to expand. And so that took them to the next church. And Miles, if we can have that picture of the next church. This is the first brick church that we had, and the church was built from 1916 through 1936 is where it was. It was built, in 1849, and you can see it was remodeled in 1877, 1904, and 1916. Some of the reasons for the remodeling was because originally it was built on wooden planks, was the base of the foundation, and some of those started to sag. It's interesting that the first white church that we had, we actually sold it to an individual who then did one of the very first property swaps. He turned around and sold it to the Baptist church, who took it off, who later sold it to the Lutheran church. And so that first white church, although it was small and no longer fit the needs of our church, apparently the construction of that church was so strong that that building was moved 5 separate times, and it was held by 6 different sets of people, and it continued on through all those times. Unfortunately, this original brick building didn't seem to be constructed quite as strong or in the way that that first building was. And so there was definitely needs to remodel the church. And let me just say, Miles, if you can move to the slide about the ministers. Yeah. Oh, good question, Dale. I'm sorry, I should have said that, and I forget that people don't know that. Every single church has always been on this property. It has faced different directions. This church has not always been in the same direction that it faces now. But it has always been on this exact property. And there are rumors. Originally, it was thought that the land was gifted by George Starkweather, but that was later proved not to be true, and that they actually did purchase the land. The land that was gifted to the church was part of the cemetery land that was gifted by George Starkweather, which surrounded the church at the time. Now, we're going to be talking as we go on about how the church and the city traded property through the years, because that's how the footprint of our church developed. And so we will talk about this. Now, first, this is the list of the ministers, 35 ministers, as you can see, from 1835 through 1836. What I want you to notice is that in the first 30 ministers, none of them stayed longer than 9 years in total. In the first 30, and only 1 out of those 30 served as long as 9 years. 14 of the ministers only stayed 1 year or less. Now, some of that sometimes had to do with war and different situations. Other times there were more personal reasons. But I do think it's important to note that from 1926 until today, there have only been 5 ministers. So, which has been remarkable, especially given the way that the church started. Now, why I have said and questioned whether I am the 35th minister, I don't know if anyone's caught it already. There's a minister on there, J.A. Clayton, fourth one down. He pulled what I'd call a Grover Cleveland, if you know what I mean, that he served twice, but not back to back. There was people between him. And so he served again, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 3 more down. He's on there again. So he served this church twice, but with people in between him, as Grover Cleveland did in presidency. Now, the other interesting thing, I mean, there's a lot. If you see here, B.F. Murden, right? Is that the one I'm looking for? No. Oh, yeah, Maltby. Maltby Gelston, the last name, first column, 1872 through 1873. He obviously did something very right with his children, and please don't expect this because both his sons later served as the ministers of this church. So his son, if you go back to the person that immediately followed him, was his son, J. Mills Gelston. And then if you look quite a bit down, you will find, again, about 5 names later, M.B. Gelston, 1881-82. That was his younger son. Now, interestingly enough, and if anyone can ever explain this to me, his older son and his younger son, although they had different initials, both went by the same first name, Mills. I've got nothing for you. I just thought it was interesting. So let me tell you a little bit more about some of these ministers and what we've learned about them. I will tell you that out of the first 30, almost all the way up until you get to Walter Nickel, almost every single one of these ministers went to Princeton Seminary. So now that's because Princeton Seminary was the oldest Presbyterian seminary. So there was a historic factor to that happening. So, but about the time Walter Nickel came, that it started to be from other seminaries as well. I will also say a lot of these ministers not only served our church, but at the same time served Northville. And so if you go and we were to check Northville historic records, we'd see a lot of the ministers match. So, or alternatively, sometimes the ministers served at Northville and then came here, or vice versa. So they wouldn't change very far, but they would change churches altogether. And it just sort of varied at the time if the churches could afford a minister or if they would share the cost with the First Presbyterian Church of Plymouth, which was Northville at that time. So I can tell you these ministers faced some challenges. If you look at 1854, S. Cochran, Sylvester Cochran, one day after he started work here in the church, a whale oil lamp caught fire in Roots Hotel on Main Street in downtown Plymouth, and every single business facing Kellogg Park burned to the ground on his very first day. So I will say, obviously, things were not easy for the minister. Reverend Murden, who is just 3 from the bottom, first column, he is known for taking the Presbyterian hymnal, and apparently he is responsible. He simply cut out any hymn that had 6 verses or more. He just said, that's entirely too long. It doesn't matter what hymn it is, it can't be this long. And they were just taken out of the hymnal, which I thought was hilarious. But, yes. But you have to feel for the man, because what he asked, he said, if we remove all those hymns, then we have more space for the hymns we really need. And he said, I need hymns for burying infants and soldiers. And so he was facing his own battles at that time, for sure. So I can tell you in 1893, when, let's see, our Bramfit was, no, I can't count, Wallace. When Wallace was the minister, downtown Plymouth caught on fire a second time. And the whole business block burned and everything was destroyed except 3 stores. And you might be able to help me between Penniman and Ann Arbor Street. Any idea if Ann Arbor Street is Ann Arbor Trail or Ann Arbor Road? Yeah, probably. I don't know. But it does say street in the history. Yeah. No idea. No idea. Every minister, there were some ministers who were known for being absolutely beloved, and that was definitely true of, who was it? Clayton, I think it was, that they just said, it's one line in the history said, most wonderful minister ever, period, which was lovely. So, but there were hard times as well. In 1907, under Reverend Ronald, while he was here, there was a train tragedy that happened outside of Plymouth, where just outside the border of the town, 33 passengers were killed and 100 were injured. And they said people who lived during that time remembered that event and talked about that event for years and years and years to come. So under Reverend Farber, in 1916, the high school, the park across the street, caught on fire. And the fire started in the boiler room, and it completely destroyed the high school and the Methodist church, which was at that time adjacent to it as well. So there were challenges. There's no question that there were challenges from different ministries, but what was amazing is that the church continued to grow through it all and through all the changes in the times that took place there. If we go on, Miles, can we go to the next slide, please? Walter Nickel. Walter Nickel was one of the pastors that first served this church for an extended period of time. He was here for 17 years. And he started in 1926, and when he and his wife and his 5 children were called here to the church, he was called and he was offered salary of $3,000, and that did happen and for the first 5 years of his ministry. But apparently about 1932 is when the Depression really hit Plymouth hard. And the minister's salary got cut to almost half. They had to stop paying the director of music and the organist altogether. And thankfully, there were 2 members of the church who were a little bit well off, who stepped up and paid their salary out of their own pockets. So what was interesting, and I thought this was a good tie-in to our life in Malawi, because people obviously were concerned about Walter Nickel and his family not having enough, because his kids were also getting to the point that they were looking towards college and everything, that people would often bring him live chickens as payment, much like we've received in Malawi. And they said they were not, his daughter commented in one of the history logs that it was always appreciated. It terrified their father a little bit, but it fed the family for a while. So they were very grateful. So from there, we do know and have details that on January 9th, 1936, that Reverend Nickel was passing the church, and as he was passing the church, he happened to notice smoke coming out of the roof of the church at its seams, and so he went inside the church to investigate. Again, it was 5:30 at night. He had a session meeting that night, and I cannot make this stuff up. On the agenda of the session meeting, they were discussing fire insurance. That was the agenda item for the night. And so at 5:30, he rushed into the building, discovered that it was the boiler room that had caught fire. When he opened the door toward the boiler room, it exploded, and he was blown backwards. Thankfully, he was okay. Which was good. He was not injured severely at all, and so he was able to actually get up and run to the fire station, which he did, and they called and alerted the fire truck, and so the fire department from Plymouth, the fire department from Northville, which at that time was Northville, well, part of Plymouth still, but just going through that divide. At that point, the fire people from Northville came, as well as there was a jail nearby, and they had their own fire department, and they got all three departments here. They worked on the basement. They thought that they had it under control, but then apparently there was a massive explosion that just blew through the roof, blew through the floor of the basement into the sanctuary and blew the roof of the sanctuary off. So, and as I know that you have heard before, that everything was destroyed except, oh yeah, we have pictures. This is the church roof after the fire. That was the sanctuary as they were beginning to look. Yeah, the windows before. This is the Bible that survived the church fire in 1936. It fell through the floor of the sanctuary and somehow was preserved. That and the lectern that it was standing on were both preserved. That's the lectern. I mean, truly, like, not one page was burnt. And that was so remarkable and such an incredible testimony to the faithfulness of God that that occurrence actually was listed in Ripley's Believe It or Not. And in 1936, this is it. You can see at the bottom, it says, when the Plymouth, Michigan church burned down, the only thing untouched were the pulpit and the Bible. And so it's neat that we have this historic record of our church and God's providence here in the church as that took place. So, September 7th, 1936. So I can tell you that on the day of the fire, Walter Nichols, who must have been a remarkable man and pastor, he said, "From out of the ruins there will be a new church." And an hour after the fire, he went and married a couple that he was supposed to marry that night. And just did that. Now, Fred Schrader, as in Schrader's Funeral Home, was a member here at the church, and he was part of that session that was also supposed to be gathering that night to discuss fire insurance. So he immediately offered for the church to use the funeral home for services after the fire, and they did do that for the first week or two. But very quickly discovered that it was not big enough to hold all the members and the children of the church. And so from there, they moved to the Masonic Temple in downtown Plymouth, which is the space now next to the Penn Theater, that building that's been turned into like apartments, and there's a bank on the bottom just on the other side of the Penn Theater, next to the land, next to the Gathering. That's right, the Gathering's in between, and then it's on the corner. That used to be the Masonic Temple, and so our church members met there for a year and 10 months at the Masonic Temple. They were out of the church for a year and 10 months. What they learned in that time is that the insurance that they had covered $20,000. The loss was deemed to be $35,000. They were underinsured in other ways, which is why they were looking at the policy in the first place. But in the end, the building of the new church cost $72,000 because that included the organ, the stained glass windows, the pews, the furnishings. And they were able to proceed with that, much like we did with our boiler, with a loan from the Presbyterian Church, the larger church. So now what's important to note is that fire, although devastating, I mean, thankfully, by the grace of God, no one was hurt. No life was lost. I mean, obviously, it was very, very sad that the church suffered so much damage, but this fire forever changed the landscape of downtown Plymouth, because at the time of this fire and in the year and 10 months of the rebuilding, the church and the city had a whole bunch of conversations about how downtown Plymouth should look going forward. And the city was very anxious to have Church Street extend down into Main Street, but the problem was that we owned, so if you can picture this, the church faced out towards, what am I trying to say? That way. The church faced Main Street? No, the church kind of faced, people came in, didn't they, facing the park? Like where, on the far side of Church Street, the manse was on the corner. The original manse was down on the corner of Main Street and Church Street, the original manse that got moved later. So, but what they did is our church owned the property going forward, like if you can think across the street from the front of our church into the Memorial Park. We worked a deal with the city where we would gift them that land, and they gifted us land that they owned behind our church. And so we did an exchange where then our parking and everything could go into the back of our church as opposed to the front of the church, with the understanding that the land that we gifted that was a park, as long as it forever in perpetuity would remain a park, then the city could own it and they could run it as a park, whereas we would have the back land to be able to do all the expansion that we have done. So that allowed, prior to the fire, the way Church Street is today with the two islands and the two roads didn't exist. Church Street there was a straight road that went straight past the high school and kept going. And they did not want that to happen anymore because they saw that with so many students at the school, they needed to keep those students as safe as possible. So they wanted to divert the road. And so that was one of the reasons that they opted at this time to change the way our church was laid out. Now, part of the way this was done, as I said, the original manse was located on the corner of Church Street and Main Street. The church promised that as part of this deal that they would pick up that building and the garage and they would relocate it. And so if you like, it was located, and you that remember, please tell me, it was sort of on the other side of the driveway, right? Facing outwards, facing Church Street. Right, Church Street and Harvey kind of intersects. It was there. Now, what is very interesting is that garage that they moved, if you can believe it, that garage later got moved and is still on our property, and today is our preaching shed. That is the same garage. It's been resided, it's been re-roofed, it has been all kind of things, but that is the original garage from all of that taking place. So that all happened when the church was being rebuilt. I will tell you this, and I love this story. 1 year and 10 months after the fire, on Sunday, November 21st, 1937, at 10 a.m., after a brief devotional service at the Masonic Temple, the members of this church walked from the Masonic Temple back to this church, and the children led it. The littlest children went first with a lot of helpers, I would imagine. The smallest children were led, followed by the entire congregation, including the choir. Apparently, the route was Penniman, which I can see, to Main Street, to Park Drive. Exactly, I'm not sure of that, to the church. And as the procession approached the church, the choir was singing the church's one foundation, which was the very same anthem that we opened our 187th anniversary service with on Sunday. So I think it was a powerful event coming back to the church. I know it was powerful because, God bless Sandy Dodge, in her mother-in-law's findings, they have the bulletin from that service. It was a 2-week celebration, 2 weeks, from November 28th through December 12th. It included the dedication service of the church. It included a family night, dedication of the windows service, an organ recital, a women's day, a communion service. And again, they dedicated every brand new thing that was in that building, all to the glory of God. And by God's grace, what truly is a blessing is that we get to use it. All these items that were blessed by others, we have the opportunity to use. And so it was a great day and an opportunity to grow through some difficult times. So at the end, Reverend Nickel had to give up due to ill health. And so at that time, Henry Walsh was called. Yep. And he was here the longest of any of our pastorates. He was here 28 years. He was here in a time of exceptional growth where he put on the building addition that included all the offices and all of those as they came in. During his time, the first woman elder, Margaret Daniel, was elected to session. The thrift shop opened under the watch of the Presbyterian Women's Association. Yep, and there is, and somebody can help me. I was trying to figure out, and maybe Linda Luke, you know, how many buildings has the Presbyterian thrift shop been in? It's a test. Yes, well, we'll come to the end of it, but all of them have been in Old Village, except when we had the satellite campus at the Peddler, but otherwise, it's all been in Old Village, and so... Yes, I believe now that's a brewing house, yes, now. So let me just say with Henry Walsh, there was just a phenomenal amount of church growth. He had, if you can imagine, on that time, 316 children in Sunday school. And that was the first time they had Sunday school at both services. Now, that was a time of exceptional growth for the church as a whole, not just here, but everywhere. This was also the time when we had the first assistant minister, Thomas Keefe, came, and that was the beginning of having more than one minister here at the church. So lastly, Miles, if you can move on. Phil McGee, this is the part where you guys should take over and share your stories. More than mine. I will say this, I did love this about Henry Walsh before I move on to Phil McGee, that when he was called, and let me just see if I can say this, it says in this book by Sam Hudson that a few months after the Reverend Walsh arrived, the Plymouth Mail wrote an article describing him as a big, cheerful, ruddy-faced, shaggy-haired man who talks to you between puffs of his sweet-smelling pipe and tells you of his beliefs and ideals. And then they did ask him about moving into World War II. And he says, I'm not a believer in war. I wish that we might always get along without war. But it seems to me that I, as an individual and as a pastor, must choose between two evils and take the lesser. We can't live off the benefits of war and still preach pacifism. We must love all men because they are men and the sons of God. But it does not logically follow that we must accept an unwanted way of life because a man with a gun tells us so. We must fight for what is our way of life, and I don't like war. No one does. But we have a war now, which it seems to me was not of our choosing. So, wise man and a very beloved pastor. Phil McGee, as he came, a very beloved pastor as well, who was here for almost 22 years, I think. Is that right? Oh, 20 years. 20 years. He, in the foreword of this book by Sam Hudson about the history of our church, says that the themes that this church has known throughout its history have not changed. We continue to show our need for Christ through our human nature, but Presbyterian focus has always been on worship and preaching, and our faith must always be put into action into the community. God speaks to Christians of every generation, and we are called to share and spread God's love in this community, and we are called to share that calling through the ages. So it's timeless words that he wrote, and he wrote those on the occasion of our 150th anniversary of this church. So I can tell you that I had the privilege of meeting Phil and Dorothy 25 years ago when they were back here at the church for my husband's ordination at this church. And I, at that point, had been a minister for 1 week. I had been ordained 1 week before Doug was ordained, and we were engaged. And we had a lovely dinner with Phil and Dorothy and stayed in correspondence with them till his life's end and to Dorothy's life's end. And it was a wonderful privilege to start my ministry unknowingly here with them and with Jim and with Tammy Seidel and all the people that were present, to be there in the company of what would be 5 ministers from this church at once. Between Jim, myself, Tammy, with Phil there as well. And actually, David Brown was there at the time. And David would also go on to be a minister. And I knew David from seminary as well. And Chip was there as well. And I knew Chip as well. So it was wonderful to have that there. Friends, before we go further, and I want to be very mindful of our time, I'm sure you're sick of hearing from me. And there's a lot more we can share. And I've asked some of our church members to share some of their stories and to share some of their memories of the church. And so I'm going to ask at this time for Sally Evans and Otto Dobos and Nancy and Bob White. If you guys want to come forward, there's a table here, and we've got some questions for you. Miles, can I take this out of here or no? Probably not. Or I can ask the questions from here. That's fine, if that's easier. Yeah.
I can just move it down.
If you can, yeah, if you can move it down. If it's a little bit. We're going to try this and hopefully not get too much feedback here. Okay, I'm going to ask Sally. I'm going to ask you first, what first brought you to this church?
Actually, Fred Nelson did. I was in high school across the street, and he needed choir members. Wouldn't you think that's funny now? And he asked if we had a group at the high school called Triple Trios, and he asked if we'd come over and sing at the church. And from that day forward, I've been here. I was married in this church. All the kids were baptized here. That's about it.
Fantastic. Thank you.
It's wonderful. The church is just wonderful.
Sally, is your wedding picture in the bride's room then?
Of course not.
I don't remember seeing it. It should be there.
Well, it should be, yes. Scold me.
You'll take care of it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We need them here.
You need them here? Well,
Well, and I do want to say, Sally, thank you for mentioning Fred Nelson, because this church also has a long history, not only of having long ministries for the last 100 years, but we have a long history of music people in this church for a long time. And I know Fred Nelson was here for a very long time. I know Carl Battleshell was here a long time. And obviously Jerry Smith's been here 20 years already. And I think we have, Miles, do you know that picture of that person that's on staff that's also been here a while? Anybody recognize that person? That's our present organist. That is Sue Scott, who's been here 37 years.
Yeah.
Wow. And believe it or not, the staff member that's been here longer, anybody know? Mark Gaskill has been here longer than Sue Scott. So, our night watchman.
Yeah.
So, okay, Otto, yours is a little bit of a different story. Tell us what brought you here.
Well, I'm the only foreigner on the bunch here. On the panel. I have to kind of elaborate because otherwise it might not make sense. I was born in Germany a couple months before the war ended, and my parents had escaped from Hungary because my dad was a policeman, and the Russians moving in didn't take too kindly to those. So they got on a boxcar and went to Germany, and 3 weeks later, hi there. I was telling Stone Rooks I was born in a bar. Actually, it was in a guest house upstairs in the dance hall. They had set up blankets to section off areas for the refugees. Anyway, when I was 6 years old, we finally got a chance to come to the country. And the reason I brought up props is I promised Emily I would bring this and show it to her. My mother died a year ago, February, last month. Found this in her stuff, and she never showed this to me. It's Continuing Church World Service, U.S. Resettlement. These were our... Why is this bothering me? I'm the comedian up here. These were our papers that come out here. And the name on here, sponsor, Henry J. Walsh. That's why I'm here. 1951. God, that's a long time ago. I think I'm actually one of the longest people members who was still here. I did take a 20-year break. I went to Western and stayed in Kalamazoo for almost 20 years, but came back, and rejoined the church in 1982, and this is kind of cool.
Yes. And this church actually has a history with your family, and there's been other families, other refugees sponsored by this church after the Cuba war crisis, after Vietnam. This church has resettled refugees at least 3 times that I'm aware of, and there may be more that you are aware of as well. So, Otto, yes, well, what kept you here? What brought you back?
We had joined a church in Kalamazoo. We were married in Bellevue, north of Battle Creek. Carol was a Baptist and couldn't wait to become a Presbyterian. I'll just leave it at that. No, after living in that area for about 10 years, we moved back here, and it was just natural to come back to my home church. And she loves it, obviously. She's taken part in a lot of things here, as well as some of the stuff that I've done.
Well, we are very glad you are here. So,
Me
and
too.
I saw you mouthing that you were a child in the Sunday school program of the time when it was
Henry
flourishing,
Walsh.
and the 316 children. You were
I
one
was
of
one of
those
them.
children. That's great.
Well, actually, I was. I didn't get any kind of a wild streak till college.
There you go. There you go.
We'll leave that there.
All right. Well, thank you, Otto. Nancy and Bob, you're also here, and I know you are also, like Sally, one of our 50-year or more members. What brought you guys here?
Yes, Bob, I thought you wanted to tackle that.
Well, Nancy and I were married in college in Ann Arbor in 1961, and we weren't, she was a regular church goer. She married me, but I was not. Hockey was getting in the way on a Sunday morning of going to church when I was growing up. But anyway, after we got married, we decided we really ought to look for churches. So we started looking first in Ann Arbor, where we were living at the time, and then when we moved to Plymouth in 1965, we looked at some churches in Plymouth, and then we went to Northville and tried an Anglican church and a Methodist church, which was Nancy's background. And then we came here. And we were part of the growth of this church that Henry Walsh managed to create, because he was dynamic and terrific to me. It's different than anything I had ever experienced in a minister and the way he delivered a sermon. He just was what I was looking for. And so when I asked Nancy what she thought, she said, "Well, I agree. He's really good." We decided that we would come to be part of the Plymouth Presbyterian Church. That's how we got here.
You heard Bob say that he was an irregular attender of an Anglican church, so you may guess he's from Canada. We met at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, but he's from Ontario, Stratford, Ontario, or as he likes to say, just Stratford. I'm from Stratford, and he assumes. And I'm from Detroit.
Did you attend the First Presbyterian Church in Ann Arbor when you lived in Ann Arbor at all? Did you attend the First Presbyterian Church?
We just visited a couple of times, but we never joined a church all the way through. Bob was in law school after undergraduate. And
So I'm going to ask each of you, Sally, what's your one of your favorite memories of our church?
Well, obviously, the favorite memory I have is getting married here. You can't top that. And always welcome. And Bob Weber, who is a member of the choir at the time that all of us were, I call the kids in the choir. Anyway, he would, when you would process in the morning, he would take your arm and he said, "Here we go, kiddo." And I will never forget that about Bob. And he was just this is just a wonderful, kind church to belong to. And we've been at other places. Bob was deferred from the Korean War. And we've lived other places, but this is home. And the church comes with it.
Well,
Yes.
our home is better with you in it, for sure. Otto, what about you? Favorite memories?
Well, kind of two eras. When I was a kid, it was kind of fun. I went, as you said, I went through the Sunday school from earliest I can remember. I went through confirmation, and I was telling Stone Rooks I meant to bring my Bible because I have the date in it. I can't remember. It's 1954, 55, somewhere around there. But then high school fellowship, and fast forwarding to when we came back to the church, when I came back to the church after the stint in Kalamazoo, Phil McGee formed a group called The More the Merrier, and there are people here who were in that group. We had a ball. We did all kinds of social things, and we made friends that are, long. I can't even remember how many years now, but we've remained friends, and that was a good group. It was a lot of fun, but good, fun fellowship. Got to meet a lot of people and got even closer with the church family.
Then we had the go-togethers, then we had the diners. Remember all of that?
Oh, yeah.
I ran them all.
Fantastic. All right, Nancy, what about you?
You know, Emily, I'd like to kind of combine that with question 3.
Okay.
That you emailed. Would that be all right?
Yeah, that'd be great.
We talked about it quite a bit, didn't we, honey? And that's how we'd like to.
Okay, yeah, I think that's
Do you wanna
great.
wait till you start?
No, because that's a different question for you. I asked
see.
Nancy and Bob, as one of our church's 50-year members, what are some of the biggest challenges this church has had to face, and what do you think are the church's greatest strengths?
Okay, and then combining that with favorite memory, I'm going to try to weave that together. You help me, honey. Okay, into the mic, Bob said. I mean, there were issues in the social issues, you know. Phil McGee had a really good sermon one time on gun control, and somebody left the church, you know, and that kind of thing would happen through the years, but we always recovered from something like that. But then in 2020, COVID hit, and it was just devastating, but the church hardly faltered. I can't say it. You know, we started receiving our Wednesday emails, remember that, and Friday emails and so forth. And then before you knew it, by December of 2020, we had a Christmas carol sing in the parking lot in our car. Poor Bob had to listen to me. I always know the words, but I never have the notes, you know. And he has a terrific voice, and I just wished he could have been heard. But I just remember Jerry leading, you know, the choir members that were there and all of us in our cars. And then the wonderful worship committee and our pastors decided, well, we're going to have to expand on this vista of the parking lot. And I'm looking at two of the people who were so key to planning, you know, an expanded parking lot service. And I'm looking over here to my left at Kiki's husband, Jack Farrell, and bringing in, there we were on 88.5, and all of a sudden we had the preacher's porch. I mean, wasn't it fantastic? To me, that was just so marvelous. It's so great an example of making lemonade out of a terrible situation, and then we were asked to support things that needed to be done in our church building, and we all did, didn't we? It was just incredible. But thank you for those that made the parking lot such a marvelous service.
One thing that this church has been blessed by are by people's gifts and abilities, and the fact that Jack Farrow could buy a $10 transmitter off Amazon and with parts from the thrift shop, build a receiver that allowed us to have the service in the cars was amazing. And then the fact that Dana and Jim Bernard and Dana Stonerock were to see the potential in a shed that most of us wouldn't see the potential in, but yet became something not only that was invaluable for allowing us to meet, but something we looked forward to. And I will tell you as a little preview, and you can pray for Session when we meet next. One of the things Session is voting on at our next meeting is that this summer we would return back outside for our upper room service. We'd keep our sanctuary service as well, but we'd also have an outdoor service for the summer so people can come.
Great.
Because people have really, really enjoyed that opportunity.
Yes.
So we are grateful. The strength of this church is the people in the church and their willingness to lean on each other. And I'm just so grateful for our panelists tonight for your willingness to share. I wonder if anyone has any other questions for the panelists while they're up here. Jan, I see your... Mm-hmm.
Which was at sister time, basically.
Yeah.
And they were the two who were the ones who really made us feel welcome on Sunday morning.
That's great.
But you know, you can't, you say things like that, and when you think of our choir now, and you think of Bob Weber and Betty, putting up with us, you know, a bunch of high school kids, and, you know, no talent at all, and they never made us feel not welcome. This church is the most welcoming place I've ever known.
Any other questions for our panelists? Thank you all for sharing your stories. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks, Otto. Can we put that on the table in the back? That would be good. Yeah, I do. So I've asked Otto to put the Church World Service card that he has on the back table so that we have a chance to take a look at it. Sure? Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. I will say this church has tons of wonderful women in this church, wonderful men, and it's been a joy to be able to be here and to serve here has been truly an honor. One fact that I left out is in 1869, in October, the first women in this church were invited to be on a committee, which was a big deal because it was setting a precedent. Now, it was the cleaning committee that they were invited to be on to begin with, but it was still setting a precedent because the members of the session invited them to be on the committee. But it was as early as 1882 that in our session minutes, the Ladies' Aid Society was first mentioned by session as early as 1882, even though the society had been formed actually 4 years earlier. And as early as 1930, the Peace USA started ordaining women. And as I've mentioned before to you, that Margaret Daniel was the first woman elder here in this church, and that happened in the 50s, that she was invited to be an elder here in this church. And I will say one special story about Margaret Daniel. I do often, well, once a year, I go with the either fifth season choir or with the choir members to Fox Run, and we do worship services out there. And this was years ago, one of my first times out to Fox Run, and we were doing, I think, we were absolutely doing a Christmas service. And so I went out there, the choir sings, and then I just have to not mess up. So it's a beautiful night, and I was speaking, and I had brought with me part of the creche. I don't know if you know, in our church, we have a huge creche that is like Mary and Joseph are both this big and weigh about 50 pounds each. And then there's a manger and Jesus that's about this big. And Jesus itself, I mean, it weighs about 25 pounds, the creche. And for whatever reason, not knowing anything, I took that with me to use as a prop during the talk at Fox Run. And Margaret Daniel's daughter is there as a resident with her husband, and her name is also Margaret. And she came, and what I did not know is that her family had gifted that creche to the church. And so when I took it and when I did the talk, she was just elated. But it just reminds me that there are connections to this church all over the place. I mean, through various places like Fox Run, through people living all over. And it is a blessing to be able to be part of that wider extended family going forward. I have to tell you that in preparing for tonight, I did see some of the similarities between going out of the church at COVID and our congregation leaving the church at the fire and having to be outside our church building, and that challenge that comes with being outside. I think also with the challenge comes opportunities. And as we saw with the church in the past, as they used that as an opportunity to do some of the redesigning of Plymouth and the redesigning of our church, I'm so very grateful to our building and grounds team who, during the time when we were apart, stepped up and did all those jobs that we've put off, including the roof and the HVAC and the sprinkler systems and security systems, and renovating the sanctuary, getting that done, renovating the chapel and even this room. It was taking a difficult situation and seeing God's grace in it, and knowing that together we are absolutely stronger than we are apart. And so I'm grateful for each and every single one of you. I wanted tonight to end. I have a couple questions for you, and I have prizes. Prizes for see how well you were listening, and see if we can do these as a little ending trivia game. Okay, I'm going to start off easy. Who can tell me how many cookbooks this church has published? I see any answers. I got the right answer that I'm aware, and correct me if I'm wrong. I believe the answer is 2. Does 2 seem like, does anybody know of a third? No, which means Susan Evans is right. And I get prizes. I have Christmas cards. Yes, not a cookbook. Sorry, the cookbooks are completely sold out as far as I know. Yes, I know. We may have to republish at some point because they really, truly are gone. Yes, I would agree. Who can tell me how many time capsules this church has and where are they located? Time capsules, there's one in the tower room. Way to go, Otto. I'll give you a prize for that. Yes.
Is the other one by the original manse?
No, not quite. This next one is difficult. So I will say Otto's right. The one he's talking about in the tower room looks like a chest on the floor. It was done at our 175th anniversary under Jim Skimmons. And so that's there. Anybody else? Not the Memorial Garden.
Is there one in the stairway that was built from Fellowship Hall up into the original archive?
You are so close. It's built from Fellowship Hall up into the back of the church. Yeah, so the cornerstone of the church, when it got redesigned, they built the church around the original cornerstone. And so if you take that stairwell down at the back of the church, from the back of the church down to Fellowship Hall, and you may not even know there's a stairwell there, but there is. The cornerstone is in that stairwell, and behind the cornerstone are 3 different time capsules between Walter Nickel, Henry Walsh, that they all put different times behind that. So, because there was an original glass bottle one from the first brick church. And when that was destroyed, they were able to rescue that. It took months, but they were able to rescue it after the fire. They took the bottle and then they added it and they added other things, and then it got later added and was put in when they rebuilt the church.
So, well done.
Okay, and I'll only ask once more because I know our time is done. Where was the first Presbyterian Church of Plymouth built? Northville! Who said it? Sue! Trick question. All right. Thank you. All right. Everybody else, I can tell you there will be more of these Christmas cards if you're interested. I have no idea when these Christmas cards are from, but they are from a long time, and we have a lot of them. So if God moves you to take them and you want to leave a donation, that would be great. But know that they are here, and please help yourself, and thank you so much for coming. I hope you have a good night.